So what I'd like to do this morning is answer a question I often get. Fell at the Federal Reserve Bank for something like 40 years. I started when I was 12. Guy who used to worry about business cycles, inflation, unemployment, banks. How do you go from worrying about banks to worrying about babies? It's a question I always get, so I'm going to start my talk this morning giving you that backstory, and it'll give you some idea why it's been almost 12 years now I've been involved in this issue, and why it has, why I'm so passionate about presenting this research over and over again to get policymakers to understand how critical what I call the foundation years are. So I'll give you that backstory as to why and how I got started. And then I'll dig into the research a bit. I have a hunch, this crowd's probably familiar with some of this research, but we took an economic lens to it. And as Mary said, our bottom line was early childhood development is economic development. And it turns out, when you look closely at this research, and it really is overwhelming, that it's economic development with a very, very high public return. In fact, 12 years ago, we argued it is the best investment the public can make, and we have yet to be challenged on that. But I'm not going to leave you there. I'm going to end this talk with a discussion of how we took the research and put it into the real world. And this is where the business community comes into play. This is where the Itasca Project, this is an organization called MELF, the Minnesota Early Learning Foundation, got together, raised a bunch of money privately to take the research and put it into practice. So I'll kind of end my talk with what we did here in Minnesota and how that's influencing public policy, Twin Cities, state of Minnesota, in fact, in the country. December 10th at the White House, there's going to be an early learning conference, and what we've been doing here at Minnesota is going to be featured. So how do I get started? Group of us, downtown Minneapolis, would meet once a month, again, going back about 12 years. And we'd invite a CEO, an academic, a publisher, a media person, whatever, to talk about their passion in a casual environment at a lunch. So again, 12 years ago, a man by the name of Todd Otis, who was the executive director at that time of an organization called Ready for K, Ready for Kindergarten, an organization that was founded with the help of former Governor Al Quie, a Republican, and former mayor of Minneapolis, Don Fraser, a Democrat, and they were pushing pretty hard, and Todd was presenting the case for the state putting significantly more money into early childhood education. And I'm listening, as you are to me, I'm listening to this talk, and at the end, asked questions and comments, and I actually wasn't very happy with that talk. I said, Todd, basically you're making a moral argument. You're saying this is the right thing to do for these kids, and I don't disagree with that, but you know, you can make moral arguments for investing more in K through 12, you can make a moral argument for investing in more in higher education, investing more in reducing crime, reducing pollution, and the list goes on and on. Policymakers need more than moral arguments. As we're well known, it is well known today, government has limited resources. So the real question for economists would be, how do you invest those resources in the most effective way? For example, you don't want to get me started, but do we build the Vikings another stadium? Don't want to get me started on that. Okay, so as I tell people, that was my first mistake, because Don Fraser, Al Quie, they didn't disagree with me, so they start calling me up and say, all right, we agree. How would you like to come on the board and do the research for us? I said, wait a second, guys. My expertise is pre-Civil War banking, okay? And Mary has never invited me to speak on that issue. But you know, this is a former governor, and this is a mayor, and my directors at the Federal Reserve said, sure, go ahead, Ronak, you can go on this board. It's apolitical. We have to stay as apolitical as we can at the Fed. And so I agreed to do that. I went back to my office. I had a young colleague who was, he was our economic education outreach person for K through 12, Rob Grunwald. And I said, Rob, I've committed us to do this. But not to worry. I suspect we can go to this research, take us a few months, we'll just summarize it, maybe do a meta-analysis, but it'll be pretty straightforward. We'll give this to Ready for K, and we're done. With a little prodding from the board at Ready for K, we actually got that report out in 3-4 months, handed it to Ready for K, thought I was done. I was back in my office digging through my pre-Civil War banking data, and the phone starts ringing, literally off the hook. They took that paper that we wrote, just a background paper, and I thought it was all pretty obvious, by the way, and they start pushing it out. So 6 months later, I find myself in Orlando, Florida, guest of then Governor Jeb Bush at the National Governors Association, featuring early childhood education and the economics of early childhood education. A year after that, relatively new president of Turkey, invites us to Istanbul to speak to about 300-400 delegates from all over the Middle East, including the Queen of Jordan and members of the Saudi Arabian royal family on early childhood education. Year after that, a name some of you may be too young to know this name, Mike Milken, who was the junk bond king of 1970s and 80s, went to jail for a few things he shouldn't have done, but gets out of jail and creates 2 foundations, one on cancer research, because he had prostate cancer, and the other on education, because the Milken Company owns KinderCare, okay, an international preschool program. His lawyer had heard me speak in Washington and asked if I'd come out to Beverly Hills, California, to speak at his Economic Global Summit. You go to Beverly Hills, California to speak for Mike Milken, and you're surrounded by all these celebrities. He puts me on a panel with Andre Agassi. Okay. Now, I'm a tennis player, weekend tennis player. It's like I'm a groupie. There's Andre Agassi. So why Andre Agassi? So Andre Agassi has his own foundation. He started a charter school for at-risk Latino children in Las Vegas. And we started chatting. He was wondering, again, why is a Fed guy involved in early childhood? We had a wonderful discussion, and I'm proud to say his charter school now has added an early ed program. Okay, that's the backstory. What did we say in this paper that got all this attention? And I can tell you, when we finished the paper, as I said before, it was pretty obvious. What I thought we did, we weren't doing original research. We were taking research that had been out there for many, many years. We took an economic lens to it. And what did we find that got all this attention? Okay, so the research is really 2 parts. The first part is the wrong way to do economic development. I'll summarize that very quickly. I don't think it'll be hard to convince you that we literally spend billions. In fact, the New York Times estimated 80 billion plus that we spend in this country on economic development, and the return is 0. Okay? The return is 0. So what do I have in mind here? I'll give you the hometown example. A number of years ago, Lawson Software was in downtown Minneapolis, 500 well-paying jobs. They're looking to double in size, very successful company. And they were going to do this in Minneapolis. But they happened to sit down with the mayor of St. Paul, who's trying to reinvigorate downtown St. Paul, understand why he would want Lawson Software to come over to St. Paul, and 500 jobs plus additional 500 jobs. They offered, at public's expense, roughly $110 million to build an office tower for Lawson Company in downtown St. Paul. Now listen, you're the CEOs of Lawson, you're not going to turn that down. They didn't. And the mayor had an easy job selling this to the taxpayers, because you now have potentially 1,000 new high-paying jobs in downtown St. Paul. Those people spend money, right, in downtown St. Paul, so there's these so-called multiplier effects. You get all these wonderful benefits. So why am I saying that's a 0 public return? Suppose you're the mayor of Minneapolis, Sharon Sales Belton at the time. She wasn't very happy, right? She just lost 500 jobs, plus a potential for another 500. That multiplier, the positive multiplier in St. Paul, that's a negative multiplier in Minneapolis. It's what economists call a zero-sum game. Public has just spent public dollars, over $100 million, to a private company. And if you're the governor of Minnesota and you ask how many new jobs were created in the state of Minnesota with that investment, 0. We moved them from Minneapolis to St. Paul. The public return was 0. The private return was very high. My critics say, well, wait a minute, Roland, go to downtown St. Paul. You can see that office tower going up. You can see the construction workers. I said, well, wait a second. If they hadn't been in St. Paul, they would have done it in Minneapolis. There is no return to the public on that. Now, I'm giving you the hometown example. This goes on all the time, all over the country. We dubbed it the economic bidding war many years ago. We know the sports teams are very good at this. Roughly 90% of professional sports facilities, these are private businesses, are built with public money because they can play a game. What's the game they play? You don't do it for me, I'm going to another city. You don't want to be the governor or the mayor that loses the Vikings, loses the Twins, loses the Timberwolves, loses the Wild. They all play that game. The return to the public, from a national perspective, is zero. This is where the New York Times got the data I didn't have, and they show this country spends close to $80 billion a year, cities and states, trying to lure each other's businesses. And from a national perspective, not one new job. 80 billion, you know what we can do for early childhood, health, development, and education nationally with $80 billion? I can beat zero, okay? I know I can beat zero. Okay, so the first part of the essay was the wrong way. So what's the right way to do economic development? Before I had looked at the literature on early childhood education, my knee-jerk reaction, and I presented this to the Federal Reserve Board of Directors many years ago, my knee-jerk reaction is invest in human capital. Why would I have said that? Post-World War II, if you look at the so-called economic miracles, starting with Japan and South Korea and China and India and Poland today and Ireland, a key ingredient in every one of those countries is the quality of their workforce, how well they educated their kids and trained their workers. And you should know that. Because here in Minnesota, we have one of the best economies in the world, and it's because over time, it wasn't always true. If we go back to 1920, up until 1950, this was a pretty mediocre economy. Starting sometime in 1950, and I don't know if it was Hubert Humphrey, but we made a decision in this state to start investing in education, and about 1958, up until the year 2000, we start to outperform the national economy. And the obvious explanation is our education metrics go through the roof. Our women become #1 in education metrics. Overall, I think we're like 5 or 7. And I'm going to argue that's not just a correlation, that's causality. We, on a per capita basis, have more Fortune 500 companies than every state but one. Why is that? Today we know it's not the weather, right? Not the weather, these Fortune 5. They're here because of this workforce. They're here because the educational environment here is unbelievable. It was created many years ago, and we continue to invest well. Hopefully we will continue to do that into the future. Okay, so that's before I looked at the early childhood education literature, because the question is, as I sort of said earlier, and I said this to Ready for K, so the next dollars, where is the most effective way of investing the next dollars in education? So it was interesting going to the early childhood literature. I'm going to talk about one study, but there's several of these studies with the same conclusion. Okay, so what study am I going to talk about? Perry Preschool. It's pretty famous in the education literature. I'll briefly review it for you. This is a study that began in Ypsilanti, Michigan in the early 60s. Somebody had this bright idea that, you know, if you invest in the early years, you might really get a good outcome. And so they wanted to test that. So they took 123 at-risk families. Okay, they randomly divide them into 2 groups. So the methodology doesn't get much better than this. So half the children get high-quality early ed. What is high-quality early ed? Master-level teachers, 5 days a week, home visits, working a lot with the parents, all right? Perry Preschool was very parent-focused. And then there's the control group, and the control group literally doesn't get any early ed, okay? Hard to replicate that today, but back then it was relatively easy to do. And then they follow the kids for 10 years. A 10-year study, actually, it looked like, I don't know if you saw Charles Murray, famous bell curve guy, wrote a piece about how you can't affect IQ, give up parents. In Perry Preschool, after 10 years, it was viewed as a failure because IQ of these kids went up that were in the program group that got the high quality early ed compared to the control group. The IQ goes up, but by the 3rd grade, it comes back down. Looked like Charles Murray was right. You can't do anything. But then 20 year, 30 year, Rob and I had 30 years worth of data, and we're looking at outcomes. And the kids who are in the high quality early ed programs, less likely to need special ed, less likely to be retained in the first grade, more likely to be literate by the sixth grade, graduate high school, get a job, pay taxes, stay off welfare. And the crime rate between the two groups goes down 50%. So a couple of economists, we ask a very simple question that economists or business people would ask. What was the return on that investment? The investment in today's dollars, these were 3 and 4 year olds, it was roughly $10,000 in today's dollars per child, so it was a $20,000 investment. What was the return on that investment? We knew the cost, $20,000 per kid. We have all these benefits, and what economists can do, and what we do all the time, is we can put dollar values on such benefits. So we can put a dollar value on not having to place a child in special ed, and not having to retain a child, and having the child be successful, earn more income, stay off welfare, pay taxes, and we can put a dollar value on crime. Take some sophisticated analysis, but we do that all the time. So we have the dollar benefits that go out 30 years, we have the dollar cost, and there's a formula that allows you, once you have that data, to back out the annual rate of interest on that investment. So I said, when I first started, I know I can beat zero. Perry Preschool looks like it's pretty impressive. But if you're really going to go out in the real world and ask the public to invest in this, in early childhood development, as Ready for K wanted to do, you need to face the alternative cost. What's the alternative cost? Well, one way to think about it is, what does the market earn on average in this country? So we looked at the stock market post-World War II, and the annual rate of return post-World War II in the stock market, inflation adjusted, 5.8%. As I tell people, that's not my 401k, but that's what it is. Okay, 5.8, there's the hurdle. So we figured if we could get a 7% return out of the Perry program, we can make a case that we're underinvesting and that we should be putting more money into these programs. We got an 18% inflation-adjusted return. Now, actually, I got nervous with that number. It looked so high that I didn't think it would be believable. So we took all the data, we sent it to the University of Chicago, a man by the name of James Heckman, who was independently working in this area. He's a Nobel laureate. I said, Jim, this number looks way too high. I know you know this data. Would you redo these calculations and see if we're right? A couple months later, he has his grad students going over it, sends me an email, 18% inflation-adjusted rate of return, that's the number. Critics say, you know, this is small sample size, yeah, but as your statisticians may know, if you have a small sample size, the variances are huge. It's very hard to get statistically significant results, and we did. And by the way, we suspect that this 18% is a conservative estimate. Why do we say that? We didn't have data on siblings in the family. Odds are, if these parents are doing better and the children in the program are doing better, the siblings would be doing better. We didn't have data on the parents themselves. We've got anecdotal data suggesting that many of these parents went back to school. So there's another benefit. Data that we're just starting to get on health metrics. Mary mentioned NIH. NIH has been now finding that the foundation years prenatal to 5 are critical for long-term health. Child born full weight, full term, et cetera. They're showing that mental illness, diabetes, heart disease, you name it. Child healthier at the beginning is much healthier in later years. We didn't have any data on health benefits, okay? We're just starting to get data on children of the children. Odds are, if our children coming out of poverty are doing better and are succeeding, odds are their children are going to succeed. We didn't have that data. So that 18%, despite the critics, I'm going to say that's a conservative estimate. I suspect once we get the health statistics, that number could double. Then then they said, well, it's just one study. But we actually have 2 other longitudinal studies. One known as the Abecedarian study, which started at 0, kids at birth. That study gets double-digit returns and Heckman has found some health metrics associated with that study, and sure enough, he's showing significant long-term benefits if children were in high-quality early ed programs, significant long-term benefits on heart disease. Then there's the Chicago study. This is my co-director at the University of Minnesota, Arthur Reynolds. He's famous for his work on the child parent centers. This is age 3 to grade 3. Children get a high-quality early ed program, and then they go to high-quality K through 3, which is critical. And he gets doubled. He got the same number we got out of Perry. He got an 18% inflation-adjusted return. So I'm going to argue, if you look at the longitudinal studies, and we did, we're way under, as a country, we're way under investing in high-quality early childhood education. Later in this talk, I'll sort of challenge you as to why that's true. You know, if businesses saw an 18% inflation-adjusted investment, wouldn't take very long for it to be fully funded, and we're still struggling. I'll get back to that later. Okay, so I was giving a talk like this in Boston a number of years ago, and a gentleman heard me and brought me aside. He was at Brandeis, brought me up to Brandeis and said, Art, I really like what you're saying. I know you're working on a second essay, on a public policy essay. That is, what's the lessons for public policy makers? He said, I really like what you're doing. I think it's great what you're talking about. Perry Preschool, 3- and 4-year-olds, terrific. However, for the kids you're most worried about, the most vulnerable children, 3 and 4 is too late. Too late. I had no idea what he was talking about. The man's name was Jack Shunkoff. Jack was the co-editor of a book, From Neurons to Neighborhoods, that came out in 2000. And it summarized back then all the research on brain development that neuroscientists have been learning. And basically what he said to me is, look, Art, something like 80–90% of that brain is developed in these foundation years. And for many of the kids by age 3, it's too late. And he pointed out research, for example, which is the classic study on the Romanian orphans. Romanian orphans, if you remember, had very little human contact. They were fed 3 times a day, and that's about it. They did brain imaging of those kids. Those brains were 1/3 smaller than what brains should be. What the neuroscientists have learned in a way, Jack, when he talks on this, the debate between nature and nurture is over. We know if a child's in a stress, they call it toxic stress. If a child's in a stressful environment, and I want you to equate that kind of stress with poverty, so the family's constant stress, the child picks it up right away. By age 3, things aren't connected properly. The brain hasn't developed right. So when Jack says it's too late by age 3, that's what he means. There's plasticity there. It isn't that you can't overcome some of this later on in life, but it's much more effective to start at the beginning for lots of reasons. Okay. So Jack throws out a challenge. He says, okay, Rolnick, if you're going to come up with a policy, you better start early. Whatever you suggest, you better start early. In fact, you better start prenatal. That's one challenge. The other challenge is better be high quality. You're not going to get this if you take a child, put them in a center-based program, they put them in front of a TV. It better engage the parents. If you don't engage the parents, if you don't have those parents and that family involved, just take the child, put them in a center-based program, put them back into a dysfunctional family, not going to get these double-digit returns. So you just got to start early. It's got to be about quality. You've got to engage the parents. And I'm going to argue, in fact, I argued, early on, that if you can't bring it to scale, if you can't do this for every kid, if you can't take advantage of that 18% return across the board, you're going to fail. That is, if you can only do it for 20% of the kids. I know there are some great teachers out there. There's great programs. People send me all kinds of articles on this. Jeffrey Canada, I'm a big fan of Jeffrey Canada. He's the executive director of the Harlem Children's Zone, doing great things. Went to one of his board meetings and said this to his board. I said, look, here's my problem. I point to Jeffrey and I say, I can't clone this guy. I need him in Cleveland, in Detroit, in St. Paul, in Sioux Falls. I need him all over the country. I can't clone him. I can't depend on the superheroes in this field. I got to come up with a system that we can bring to scale. Okay, so here's the bottom line of the second essay. Here's what a couple economists were brought up. I was trained by Walter Heller here. That's why I came to the University of Minnesota many years ago to think about markets and the importance of markets. So ours is a market-based system, if you will, very simple. Scholarships, early learning scholarships. So scholarships not to send your kid to Harvard or MIT or University of Wisconsin or University of Minnesota. Scholarships to send children to high-quality early ed programs. Notice I said high quality. And you say, wait a minute, scholarships, that's 3- and 4-year-olds. Well, our scholarship includes money for home visiting nurses, starting prenatal. Another longitudinal study by David Olds, very famous in this area. His home visiting nurses, his results show, again, double-digit returns. They show that families, that mothers that get home visiting nurses starting, you got to start about 2nd, 3rd month of pregnancy, that you reduce infant mortality, you're more likely to get full-term babies, and long-term results, again, are incredible on the health aspects of it as well as the cognitive. So that's our program. It was pretty simple. Wrote that second essay, and I was very fortunate. A man by the name of Warren Staley got a hold of that essay. Warren Staley at the time was CEO of Cargill, and he was chair at that time of Twin Cities United Way. And he says to me, Rolnick, this sounds good. You know, you're in this ivory tower over there at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, beautiful building and everything and all that, but will it work in the real world? He says, here's what I'm proposing, and here's what he proposed. We're going to create an organization called the Minnesota Early Learning Foundation. We're going to raise a bunch of money, and we're going to see if it works. So Warren Staley puts together a board that included Ken Powell, CEO of General Mills, Mark Banks, who was CEO of Blue Cross Blue Shield at the time, Mike Cerisi, Bob Brunix, president of the University of Minnesota, Doug Baker, Ecolab, Gene Taylor from the Taylor Corporation, and Charlie Weaver, who was at that time Governor Pawlenty's chief of staff and then became head of the business partnership, which represented about 100 of the major corporations in this state. So it was a business-oriented board, and what did we do? We raised $20 million. How do you raise $20 million overnight? Well, our first board meeting, Warren Staley, and these are all his friends, right? Warren Staley says, okay, Cargill's in for $5 million. What are you guys in for? That's one way to raise $20 million. No, but Dwayne Benson was the executive director, and I give a lot of credit for Dwayne to help us eventually get to that $20 million mark. And then about half of that money went to develop a rating system. Remember, we have to have quality. So we got to know what quality is. So we created something called Parent Aware, which, by the way, is going national now. I'm sorry, it's going statewide now. And the idea of Parent Aware is a 4-star rating system. When we went out with the advice of the University of Minnesota developing the rating system, developing quality indicators, like classroom size and quality of the teachers, quality of the program, et cetera. And then it was all voluntary, we went out and rated early ed programs, okay? And in fact, today, if you go on the Parent Aware website and you put in your zip code, you'll find within a 5-mile radius all the early ed programs and what the ratings are. So this is information for all families. The rest of the money we used for scholarships. We circled a neighborhood in St. Paul, Frogtown. We did that because the mayor of St. Paul had heard we were going to do that, and he wanted to be the first city to do this kind of investing, offered up his staff. And we circled a neighborhood, Frogtown, low-income neighborhood. It was very simple. You lived in Frogtown. Income was 185% poverty or below. Congratulations, your child gets a scholarship and the family gets a mentor. All voluntary. You don't have to use the mentor, you don't have to use the scholarship, but that's what we offered up. At first, we had some problems kind of getting into the community. Who are we? You know, there was a trust issue, but then a bunch of faith-based and community leaders started to talk it up. And within a relatively short period of time, we ran out of money. 650 scholarships to children born into poverty so they could go to high-quality early ed programs. My critics said, ain't going to work in Frogtown, Rolnick. There's no 4 3-star programs there. Of course they're not. I mean, it's a poverty area. You got to go out to Plymouth to find those kind of programs. But I said, wait a second. Wait till the market learns that 650 families with scholarships paying up to $13,000 a year are in the neighborhood. Within 6 months, New Horizon built a brand new facility just north on Rice Street, just north of the Capitol, on a bus line. Montessori expanded theirs, a bunch of faith-based expanded theirs, St. Paul School expanded theirs. Within 6 months, virtually every one of our families found a 3-4-star rated program. The other critic said, you know, these families are so dysfunctional, they probably won't even use the scholarships. Wrong. Virtually every one of our families used the scholarship. There's a couple that moved out of state. There were a couple that had special needs children that we couldn't service. But virtually every family used the scholarship. Markets work. Once the market knew that there was funding out there, they started to create the infrastructure. We didn't have to worry about the infrastructure. And the nice thing about the market working is one size doesn't fit all. For some families, it may be Montessori. For some families, it may be Head Start. It's got to be 4-star, though. For some families, it may be a faith-based. For some families, when I mentioned language immersion. So the nice thing about the market is these parents are now empowered. Like with Head Start only serves about 30% of the eligible kids in this country. And if you get into Head Start, if you're lucky enough to get in there, you're told where to go, and here's the program, and if you don't like it, too bad. We changed that. Our parents are empowered. If they don't like Head Start, they go to Montessori. Head Start has to compete now. And on average, Head Start needs to compete. They don't have the quality that we need. There's some terrific Head Starts out there, but to improve quality, economists will tell you, give me competition. So we've got this competition going because the parents are empowered. The parents are empowered. They're getting engaged. When we had focus groups with these parents and we asked, what did you think of the scholarships? What did you think of the mentors? They're big. They love the scholarships. They love the mentors. They'd never seen anything this user-friendly because once they got the scholarship, it was theirs. They moved, whatever, didn't matter. The scholarship was there. They could use it anywhere in the state as long as it was a 3- or 4-star rated program. Here's their biggest concern. Most of these parents hadn't graduated high school. And their biggest concern was, is K through 3 going to be a 3- or 4-star rated program? These parents are now worried about the quality of their public schools or their private schools or whatever. I declared victory right there because now we've got parents that have some future for their children, looking for education, recognizing how important education. I got to brag about one program, Northside Achievement Zone. It's one of Obama's promised neighborhoods here in the north side of Minneapolis. So what we do in the north side, when our children graduate these high-quality early ed programs, they get a T-shirt, okay? Now they go up on stage, and we do this big graduation ceremony, and we get the parents involved. You read about a lot of negative things about the north side. You don't read about all that's going on there on education now. Our kids graduate, they get a T-shirt. What does the T-shirt say on it? It's got a date. It's a date when they're going to graduate college. People say, you got to change the culture. I don't know how to change the culture, but we can empower these parents and provide incentives so their children can succeed in school. So that was the Minnesota Early Learning Foundation. We were very fortunate. We brought an outside evaluator in. Our children in the first grade were doing well, significantly better than their peers, so that kids in that neighborhood or in a close-by neighborhood who didn't get the scholarships, who didn't get high-quality early ed, they were doing significantly better, almost as good. We weren't quite there as the majority kids. The success of that program led the state to go after a Race to the Top grant that this administration put in $500 million for early childhood education. And a number of years ago, I think it's 3 years ago now, we got $45 million to replicate what we did in St. Paul. So this is what's going on in Minnesota. The MELF pilot was a one-time 5-year deal. MELF has sunset. We handed it off. The state got the $45 million. Now we're replicating it again in St. Paul. I mentioned the north side of Minneapolis, Itasca County, a rural area, and on White Earth, an Indian reservation. I think one of the reasons we got that Race to the Top money, because our proposal included high-quality early ed pilot on a Native American reservation. So there's some incredible leaders up there on White Earth. You may know this, for the past 10 years, they've had an annual conference on brain development. And they attract some of the top scientists in the world at that conference on this reservation, in the middle of nowhere in many ways, and they get about 400 or 500 people attending that conference. So it shouldn't surprise you that the leaders of that tribe are engaged in early ed, and when they heard that they could be eligible for early learning scholarships, they went full bore. So you go up to White Earth now, and you'll find that they have, I think it's up to 100 parents on early learning scholarships, and they've got a huge waiting list. Of course, we ran out of money up there, and they're already getting significant results. So that's what we're doing in Minnesota. We're replicating what we did in St. Paul. We're focused on the most at-risk children, because I call those our high-return children. That's where the return is. And we can't afford, as an economy, we cannot afford to let these kids fail. You know, Mary mentioned I'm from Detroit. I'm working with the Kresge Foundation on the same issue for Detroit. A number of years ago when I was in Detroit, headline in the Detroit Free Press, 75% of the children that attend the public schools in the Detroit city, Detroit proper, do not graduate or do not graduate on time. I actually made this comment to some staff people at the White House. I said, I don't care how much money the federal government gives to General Motors. If you don't educate those kids, Detroit is a third world economy now. It'll continue to be a third world economy. You've got to invest in your human capital. So that's kind of the plea. That's kind of the what we're doing here in Minnesota. So what's the next step? As I said earlier, if we're not doing this for all the kids, we're failing. We're failing, obviously in a moral sense we're failing, but we're failing in an economic sense. This is, as Mary said, this is a smart investment. This is a high return, an extraordinary return investment. Before we spend another dime on a new stadium and arena, and I'm worried that now they're talking about a soccer team coming here, and guess what, guys? We gave the Mall of America $250 million. Is there a shortage of retail space, stores? Is shopping a problem in this day? Is that a public investment? And they got $250 million. Even the Mayo Clinic, as you know, got close to $500 million for, quote, infrastructure. So their patients will have a better environment. Read between the lines. That's more movie theaters and nicer hotels. That's not public. That's a private investment. Of course, Mayo, like the Vikings, said if they don't expand here in Rochester, Minnesota, they'll do it in Scottsdale. So they played the game as well. So I understand that's a difficult position, but clearly, guys, we've got an investment here, an extraordinary return that has significant economic implications now and into the future. It's why the business leaders came to the table. It's why MELF was established. These guys get it. You know, business is often criticized for only having a short-term horizon, the next quarter profits. Not true. Your successful businesses have long-term vision for their business and their community, and they know they need a high-quality workforce. They know they need low crime, quality of life, high-quality workforce, or they can't attract great workers. Don't believe it when they say they need football or baseball professional, that's how they attract the workers. When a young family looks to come to a major corporation, the first thing they ask, surveys show this over and over, what's the educational system in the neighborhood? How good are the public schools? What are the opportunities for education? That's what's critical for attracting workers, and that's what's critical for sustaining economic development. Okay, so where do we go from here? How do we bring this to scale? I'm going to talk about an organization called Mini Minds, and it's an organization that is funded by a combination of United Way, McKnight, Minneapolis Foundation, and some other early learning funders. We decided that, I was kind of naive. At the Federal Reserve, we present the research, like in poker, and the cards read, right? You're done. So I'm figuring we present this research, and it's so overwhelming, whether it's a neuroscience or longitudinal study, that St. Paul's going to figure this out and just fund early ed, just like that. We've had a little success, but in real terms, up until recently, the amount spent on early childhood education and development has actually gone down in this state. So we have all this research. The return's extraordinary, and we're failing in the political arena. Why is that? That's my challenge for you to think about. Why is that? Well, I'll give you one obvious answer. When I went to testify that the stadium, whether it was a Twin Stadium or the Viking Stadium, should be a low priority, the audience was painted in purple with the horns. The Vikings had about 12 guys in suits. I had to wear a suit because they had 12 guys with suits. and they had the quarterback, and you can sign the football. I didn't have a football to give to anybody. They're threatening to leave. What I threatened to do was I said, I'm going to take all these poverty children. We're going to move to Chicago if you don't do this. That didn't work. These kids don't vote, right? And actually, I was in Chicago, Illinois, the guest of Rahm Emanuel, the mayor there, and I made this comment. I said, kids the kids don't vote. At least that's true in Minnesota. I don't know about what goes on. I have no idea what goes on. He didn't appreciate that. And these families have very little political clout, and again, we have no leverage. So we had to actually hire a lobbying effort. We hired the Thunheim Group. I don't know if you're familiar with Kathy Thunheim, an amazing organization. It's very interesting. Thunheim represented the Vikings. So I said, Kathy, now you're on the side of the Angels, and we need you. And let me tell you, they're doing an amazing job. So we created an organization called Mini Minds, Minnesota Minds. You can go on the website. And it's basically a lobbying effort. They're amazing people. They're 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, saying, look at the research, legislators. Look at how important this is. We cannot afford, as an economy, to let these kids fall through the crack. So pretty successful in a way, because the last session we got, in total now we've gotten over $50 million for early learning scholarships. We're now serving about 10% of our children. We're going to go back, and there was just an article in the Star Tribune. Mini Minds is going to go back, and we're going to ask for the next session for $150 million. We want to get to that we want to make sure that every child that's born into poverty has these scholarships and mentors, okay? That's the goal. We don't get there without voices like Mini Minds. Maybe more importantly in some ways, we need everybody's voice. If your organization doesn't speak up, if you don't speak up on this, it ain't going to happen. It's easy to sit back. This is my call to action. This is my agenda, that we say to the state, we have to fund this for every child born into poverty in the state. Now, to really get there, and this is, I'll be testifying on this on December 8th. My proposal is a very simple one. Of course, I want the $100+ million for the next biennium, but ultimately, I want a permanent endowed fund that the state creates so every child in perpetuity would have these scholarships and mentors. So how would you do that? And years ago, I said this to Tim Pawlenty. I said, do this without raising taxes. So he was skeptical, but here's the proposal. Minnesota becomes a state in 1858. The federal government gives us a bunch of land. It's called the School Lands Trust Fund. That land, we're not the only state that got this, but new states would get this back in the 1850s and 60s. The proceeds from that land, forestry, mining, whatever, have to be used for education. Okay, so right now that money that's generated from the School Land Trust Fund goes into the K through 12 budget. It's about $40 million. Okay, my idea is very simple. We take the School Land Trust Fund, we rewrite the legislation so the money earmarked for education, but for early learning scholarships and mentors. That's it. And so we're writing this bill as we speak, and we're going to be proposing this endowed fund. It has lots of advantages. Once it's permanent, I've got this commitment from Mike Milken that whenever we get a permanent scholarship model in a community, he will come in and build a high-quality kindercare in that community. Actually, I got that commitment not only from him, but from New Horizon and from a number of other early ed providers. Once they know the resources are going to be there, they're going to be willing to invest in the infrastructure. So that's one great advantage of having an endowed fund. Another advantage is that endowment right now is valued at $1 billion. We figured we need about $2 billion, or at least $1.5 billion, to make sure every child is covered. And I have a commitment to the state, to the governor, that if we get that endowment, that we will go to the federal government and get a significant amount of matching money. And I've got some commitments from Washington that they'll do that. And the private sector. Look, the University of Minnesota can raise that kind of money for new buildings on the University of Minnesota 5-year campaign, for physical capital. Surely we can do it for human capital. So it could be a real public-private partnership for a social good. So that endowment has these advantages, that it's permanent. It says something to our community, for all our citizens, but especially for those citizens that are at the low end of the the political and economic spectrum, that we care about your children. We're going to make that investment, and this is how we're going to do it. So that's bottom line. That's my agenda. I appreciate the opportunity to make the case for you, and